Chapters 17 and 18 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 17. 1809 to 1810. The Archduchess Louise. Of all the states on the continent, the two which had felt the least effects of the French Revolution were Austria and Russia. Throughout Italy, in Spain and Portugal, and along the Rhine, the ancient thrones had been everywhere overthrown. But at Vienna, for 18 generations, since Rudolph in 1273, the imperial dignity had been handed down almost without a break in the House of Habsburg. At the close of the preceding century the Bourbons had established their dynasty almost everywhere in southern Europe. Princes of that family reigned at Versailles, at Madrid, at Naples, and at Parma. A family pact for their mutual benefit united all these different thrones; but Austria had secured a powerful influence in these capitals by her family alliances. Daughters of the House of Habsburg were enthroned at Versailles, Naples, and Parma. If the ruling family of Austria had seemed on the point of extinction after Leopold I, it had been regenerated for a moment by the blood of Lorraine. By her marriage with Duke Francis, Maria Theresa had 16 children. Her son Leopold the same number, and her grandson Francis 13. Few of these children, however, were vigorous and healthy. Many died young. The constitutional taints came mainly from the numerous marriages with the House of Bourbon. On the 1st of March, 1792, the reigning monarch Francis had mounted the throne upon the death of his father Leopold. He was the third of his name in Lorraine, the second in Germany, and the first in Austria. Since 1796 he had attacked France 4 separate times, and on each occasion had been ignominiously vanquished. After each defeat he had lost a part of his empire. At Campo Formio he had given up Lombardy, the Low Countries, and the left bank of the Rhine; at Lunéville, Tuscany, and the balance of Italy; at Pressburg, the Venetian states, the Tyrol, and the dignity of Holy Roman Emperor; at Vienna, Galicia, Dalmatia, the city of Trieste, and other small parcels. He had been forced to flee from his capital in 1797, in 1805, in 1809, and on the last 2 occasions he had seen Napoleon established as master in his palaces. His pride had been humiliated, and his choicest possessions torn from him. Although neither infirm nor aged, being indeed a contemporary of Napoleon, he had considered it beneath his dignity to command his armies in person. Having used up the ablest generals on his staff, Beaulieu, Wurmser, Albinzi, Mélas, and Mack, in the last campaign he had relied on his brothers Ferdinand, Charles, and John. Vienna was a very hotbed of anti-French sentiment. It was the place of exile on the continent of all the adherents of the monarchs and princes driven from their ancestral estates, of all the enemies of France and her emperor. Although much under the influence of these foes of the Revolution, Francis was a worthy man, of limited intelligence, but one who inspired and merited confidence. In an age of lax morals, his private life was irreproachable. He lived apart with his wife and children, his brothers and nephews. He was a most uxorious husband, and wished to have his wife constantly by his side. He was most exacting in his demands. Non qu'il soit méchant, mais il n'a point de maîtresse, et il lui en faudrait plusieurs. His entire time was devoted to minor details of his existence: the conferring of titles and favors, audiences, and military reviews. Disliking as much as Alexander the constraints of etiquette, he shared with his family their little pleasures and amusements. He was delighted with the marks of affectionate respect which always greeted his appearances in public. He regarded his subjects like a father his family. It was only on rare and solemn occasions that he showed himself in the apparel of state. He disliked and dreaded these occasions, and always seemed timid and embarrassed. He was such a good husband, so strictly faithful, that il en tue ses femmes. He was 20 years of age when he married for the first time, and his wife, Elizabeth of Württemberg, lived only 2 years. 6 months after her death he espoused his cousin Marie-Thérèse, daughter of Ferdinand IV of Naples, and Marie-Caroline, who was a sister of Marie Antoinette. By her he had 13 children in less than 17 years. She died in April, 1807, at the birth of her last child, and 9 months later was replaced by the Princess Marie-Louise Beatrice, who was another cousin, daughter of the Archduke Ferdinand. She exercised great influence over her husband from the first. She detested the French with a hatred which she had inherited from her father. This third wife of the Emperor Francis was the only one whom Napoleon knew. Of the 13 children born to Marie-Thérèse, 9 survived their mother. The eldest, Marie-Louise, was 18 years of age on the 12th December, 1809. She was a nice young girl, blonde, fresh, with a rose and white skin, somewhat marked by the smallpox. She had a mass of blonde hair, a broad, low forehead, prominent light blue eyes, widely separated. Her nose, flat at the base, heavy and sensual at the end, gave her something of a Kalmuck look. She had the heavy lower lip characteristic of the House of Austria, and white teeth, separated and somewhat projecting. She was above the average height, 5 feet 6 inches, English measure, with rather heavy, sloping shoulders, a fine but large bust, slender limbs, and very small hands and feet. The feature which most struck the observer was the heavy lip of Charles Quint, that lip out of proportion, heavy and pendant, which in the Charles II of Velasquez imprints the ineffaceable mark of melancholy idiocy. She was formed in part like a nymph of Rubens, in part like an undeveloped child. She was ungraceful, timid, and possessed no powers of attraction. "The new Empress," said Metternich, "will please Paris, and ought to please it by her goodness and her great sweetness and simplicity. Plain rather than pretty, she has a very fine figure, and when she is well dressed she will be all right." But did this consummate man of the world fully realize what was likely to "please Paris," and especially as a successor to the fascinating Joséphine? The early years of Marie-Louise possess but little interest, and can be quickly passed over. As the eldest child, at the age of 2, she was given a household of her own, of which the head was a governess, who had full authority over her life. This custodian was changed in 1794, and again 5 years later, when the Comtesse de Colloredo was appointed. She was French by birth, of a provincial family of the minor noblesse, and had married this same year of 1799, Comte de Colloredo, who occupied a high place at court, and was the real master of the Emperor and of Austria. She performed so well the task assigned her, that she continued to be the most intimate friend and confidant of the Archduchess. Under the supervision of her governess, Louise received an excellent education, especially in languages. Besides her native tongue, she spoke French, Italian, Spanish, and English. She took lessons on the piano and the harp, and had a complete course in ancient and modern history. Her life was passed at the city palace in Vienna, or at the suburban chateau of Schönbrunn. During the period of her education she was never allowed to appear on any formal occasion, not even at the fête of the family. Of all the persons of her family, it was her father whom she loved and admired the most. How could she help detesting the French, who had killed her great aunt, Marie Antoinette, deprived her grandmother, Marie Caroline, of her throne, and stolen Italy and the Netherlands from her house? She was only a child of 6 when the imperial family fled for the first time from their capital at the approach of the dreaded Bonaparte, but she was 10 when her grandmother, driven from her kingdom after Marengo, came for a long visit to Vienna. 5 years roll by, and again the family are chased from their capital by the hated Corsican. This time the disaster came closer home to her, for Colloredo was deprived of his charges, and exiled to his estates, for having advocated the war, and his wife was forced to follow him. Thus by the same blow Louise lost her "maman," and the daughter Victoire her dearest friend. From that time she was under the personal direction of her mother, until the Empress gave her a regular establishment in March, 1807. She found her mother a much harder taskmaster than her dear "maman." She was not even allowed to write her old friends without showing the letters to her mother. The little hypocrite writes in one of her letters, "Maman," this time it is the Empress, "has the kindness to guide and counsel me, and nothing is dearer to me than to follow the advice of so adorable a mother." After her mother's death she was thrown more into the company of her father, and went with him on some of his trips to the provinces and to the baths in Baden. Soon there were rumors of a new marriage of the Emperor. His third wife, Beatrice, born the 14th of December, 1787, was only 4 years older than her stepdaughter. Her father, the Archduke Ferdinand, was one of the younger children of Maria Theresa. Until 1796, when he was expelled by Bonaparte, he had governed Milan for the Emperor, and reigned over 2 of the smaller states in Italy. He had then taken up his residence in Venice, only to be exiled again after the Peace of Pressburg in 1805. It is not strange, therefore, that he and his daughter hated France and her Emperor. Nor is this all, for 2 other daughters had also been dispossessed by the French, the Queen of Sardinia, and the Dowager of the Elector Palatinate of the Rhine. After her marriage on the 8th of January, 1808, the new Empress took every means to gain the affections of Louise, and soon the dear cousin became ma chère maman. Beatrice was small, pretty, intelligent, and very adroit, but also very delicate. Although 20 years younger than her husband, she professed the most ardent love for him, and the Emperor was soon completely under her influence. This ascendancy she used for the purpose that she had most at heart, to bring about a war of revenge against France. The disaster of Balen, the first blow to the prestige of Napoleon, revived the courage and the hopes of Austria. No one believed that the Emperor would submit to this check, and if he withdrew his forces from Germany to enter Spain at the head of the Grand Army, the field would be open. While the Archduke Charles was completing the formation of his army, Beatrice, puny, ill, burning with passion, breathed the hatred of France and the hope of early victories. On the 9th March, 1809, the whole imperial family was present at the ceremony of blessing the standards at Vienna, and a month later the army crossed the frontier. During the first week of the campaign, while Napoleon once more crushed the power of Austria in one of the most brilliant operations of his career, Vienna was full of reports of glorious victories. Eckmühl was an Austrian triumph, and Louise wrote her father, "We have learned with joy that Napoleon was present at the great battle he has lost. May he also lose his head. Many predictions are made here about his coming end. They say that he is going to die this year. I do not attach much importance to all these predictions, but how happy I should be to see them come true." But in place of the expected victories, the court was forced to flee once more. On the 5th of May Napoleon was at Enns, and the Empress left Vienna, accompanied only by her stepdaughter. Her fragile nerves broken by the agony of defeat, she suffered terribly during the journey to Buda, over the broken roads under a pouring rain. But even there they could not remain in safety, for the middle of June news was received that the Archduke John had been defeated at Rabe, and that Eugene was only 12 hours' march away. They fled once more to Herlot, where Louise had only one chamber, furnished with a table, a bed, 2 torn sofas, and 4 chairs, all full of very nasty bedbugs. The Empress was still very ill, and Louise writes, "You can imagine that neither the health of Mamma nor my own is improved by this continual agony." All of her letters are full of hatred for Napoleon. When news came of the Congress to arrange the terms of peace, she wrote, "I only hope that he will be far from the place where Mamma and I are staying, for I dread a visit, and I assure you that to see this person would be to me a trial worse than martyrdom." A little later the whole family was reunited at Buda, where life once more became gay after all the trials they had endured. There were small balls, concerts, and for Louise lessons in painting. The 10th of January, 1810, Louise was still at Bude, where she was detained by the illness of her mother. At this time she wrote to her friend Victoire, "They talk of the separation of Napoleon from his wife. I think that they even speak of me as the one to take her place, but in that they are mistaken, for Napoleon is too much in fear of a refusal, and too anxious to injure us to make such a demand. Besides, Papa is too kind to constrain me in a matter of such importance." The same day she also writes her former governess, "Buda is like Vienna, and they talk only of the divorce of Napoleon. I let every one talk, and do not worry at all. I only pity the poor princess he chooses, for I am sure that I will not become the victim of politics." 2 weeks later she writes again to her old friend: "Since the divorce of Napoleon, I open every gazette at Frankfort with the idea of finding in it the nomination of the new wife, and I admit that this delay gives me involuntary uneasiness. I place my fate in the hands of Divine Providence, which alone knows what can make us happy. But, if misfortune demands it, I am ready to sacrifice my personal happiness for the good of the State, persuaded that one only finds true felicity in the accomplishment of one's duty, even to the prejudice of one's inclinations. I do not want to think any more about it, but my mind is made up, although it will be a double and very painful sacrifice. Pray that it may not be." It was probably the same day that her father informed her that in case of a demand she must be prepared for the marriage. In vain she implored him, and appealed to her stepmother for support. The Emperor invoked the supreme interests of his monarchy, and the Archduchess bowed her head. She was a true daughter of Austria. 1810. The marriage at Vienna. The contract of marriage signed on the 7th of February, 1810, by the Duc de Cadore, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Prince de Schwarzenberg, the Austrian ambassador, was immediately forwarded to Vienna by a special courier. From Schwarzenberg's letter to Metternich, sent at the same time, it is evident that Napoleon had succeeded in concealing from him the failure of the negotiations with Russia. He writes: "When one knows the character of the Emperor Napoleon, it does not seem doubtful that, if I had hesitated on my side, he would have abandoned this project to look for another." The following day the ambassador sent his secretary Fleuret to Vienna with another letter to Metternich, in which he expresses the same conviction. "If I had insisted on not signing," he wrote, "Napoleon would have broken away, to conclude either with Russia or Saxony. I pity the princess, it is true, but she must not forget, nevertheless, that it is very fine to assure peace to such good people, and to become the guarantor of tranquillity and general repose. Bring this matter to a noble end, and you will have rendered an immense service to the country." At the reception of the diplomatic corps at the Tuileries the same day, the Emperor said to Schwarzenberg: "Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, you have worked very hard these last days, and I think you have accomplished a fine task." Kurakin, the Russian ambassador, was so upset that he did not attend the reception, under plea of illness. At the court of the Tuileries there was general satisfaction. Napoleon felt that he had never gained a greater victory. The first courier reached Vienna on the 14th of February. At the Austrian capital every one was still ignorant of the proposed marriage except the Emperor, the Empress, the Archduchess, and Metternich. In his Mémoires, the minister tells us that Marie-Louise gave her consent with resignation rather than joy. The Emperor ordered him to go and see the Archduchess, and to return to report what she said. "I do not wish myself to inform her of the demand of the Emperor of the French," he said, "in order not to have the appearance of influencing her decision." When Metternich saw the Archduchess, her first question was as to the wishes of her father. He replied that the Emperor did not desire her to consider his wishes. She must decide for herself. "I only wish what my duty commands," said Louise. "When the interests of the Empire are at stake, I must consult them, and not my desires. Pray my father to obey only his duties as sovereign, and not to subordinate them to my personal interest." On hearing the report of this interview, Francis said: "What you tell me does not surprise me. I know my daughter too well not to have expected such a response. I have employed the time that you spent with her to make up my mind. My consent to this marriage will assure to the monarchy several years of political peace, that I can consecrate to healing its wounds. I am bound to consider the happiness of my people, therefore I cannot hesitate." These words show plainly that the pretended reconciliation of the Austrian court was not sincere, and the despatches of the French ambassador, Comte Otto, were most misleading. Under date of the 16th of February, he wrote to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Duc de Cadore: "Everybody thinks that this alliance will assure for a long time the tranquillity of Europe, that it will force England to make peace, that it will give the Emperor all the leisure necessary to organize, according to his high conceptions, the vast empire which he has created, The news of the conclusion of this marriage will be received with cries of joy throughout the entire extent of the Austrian monarchy." Writing to Schwarzenberg a few days later, Metternich speaks of the general sensation produced by the news of the marriage. The secret had been kept so well that the public only heard of it the day of Floret's arrival. In a letter to his wife at the same time, the minister says that it would be difficult to form an idea of the great popularity of the alliance. "If I were the savior of the world," he goes on, "I could receive neither more congratulations nor more sincere homages upon the part which all are sure that I must have taken. In the promotions which will take place, I shall have the Toison d'Or." While the court of Austria was making the arrangements for the ceremonies at Vienna, Napoleon was searching the French archives for the details of the etiquette observed at the marriages of the kings from Louis XIV. To Louis XVI. At the same time he consulted the old courtiers of the last days of the Ancien Regime, and in particular M. de De Brezé, who was the master of ceremonies at Versailles just before the Revolution. In pomp and majesty the Emperor wished the ceremonies to be superior to those at the time of the marriage of Marie Antoinette. Although it was a rule that all letters exchanged between sovereigns must be autographed, the fact that Napoleon could not write legibly had led to the tacit understanding that his letter should be written by a secretary. However, under the present extraordinary circumstances, the Emperor wished to send a letter to his future father-in-law in his own handwriting. Having taken a great deal of pains, he finally produced an epistle which was fairly readable. Then he told his secretary Meneval to go over it and rectify the badly formed words in such a manner that the correction should not be too apparent. On the 24th February the marriage was formally announced at Vienna in the Gazette. The news was well received in society, and especially in the world of affairs. Comte Otto writes, "The Empress shows herself extremely favorable to this marriage." In the same despatch he also states, "The good humor of the Viennese increases every day, especially in the world of affairs. It is above all on the Bourse that public opinion has pronounced itself in an astonishing manner. In less than 2 hours there was an advance of 30%. Confidence is re-established everywhere. Even the price of foodstuffs has fallen." The ambassador was so overcome with joy that he saw everything in a rosy light. After the marriage was officially announced, there occurred a disagreeable incident which threatened to postpone or prevent it entirely. This unexpected difficulty was regarding the annulment of the religious marriage of Napoleon. Even at Paris the matter had not been arranged as easily as the Emperor had expected. Under similar circumstances, where it was a question of the divorce of a sovereign, recourse had always been had to the Pope. The marriage of Louis XII. Had been dissolved by the Supreme Pontiff, as had also that of Henry IV. On the present occasion Napoleon thought it was hopeless for him to apply to Pius VII. The Pope had been dispossessed of his states, and was now the prisoner of the Emperor. Furthermore, as the result of Joséphine's confession to him at Fontainebleau in November 1804, the Holy Father himself had insisted upon the religious marriage of Napoleon and Joséphine, which was performed in the chapel of the Tuileries by Cardinal Fesch on the very eve of the coronation. At this time there was in existence at Paris an ecclesiastical board, composed of Cardinal Fesch, Cardinal Maury, and 6 prominent bishops. The Emperor referred the matter to this body, and they decided on the 2nd of January, 1810, that the Ecclesiastical Court of Paris had jurisdiction to dissolve the religious marriage. The request for the annulment of the marriage was accordingly presented to this court by the Arch-Chancellor, Cambacérès, on 3 grounds. First, that the ceremony had not been performed by the priest of the parish, as required by the canonical laws. Second, that no witnesses were present. And third, that Napoleon had been constrained to give his consent. This last objection was one which was usually applicable only to minors or persons incompetent mentally. The first 2 points were obviously of little weight, as the ceremony had been performed under a special dispensation granted by the Pope himself. The only valid ground for dissolving the marriage, therefore, was that the consent of Napoleon had been forced, on the eve of the coronation, by the refusal of the Supreme Pontiff to take part in the ceremony unless the relations of Napoleon and Joséphine, which were plain concubinage in the eyes of the Church, were regulated by a religious marriage. On this subject a high authority has said: "Entirely aside from the religious sentiment of the sanctity of marriage, it is difficult to comprehend how such a man should have consented to represent himself as having wished, on the eve of this grand ceremony of the coronation, to deceive at the same time his uncle who married him, his wife whom he appeared to associate joyfully with his glory, and the venerable pontiff who, in spite of his age and his infirmities, had come from so far to give him the benediction of God." But the ecclesiastical court was not deterred by any such scruples. It pronounced the marriage null and void, principally on the ground of the non consent of Napoleon. The decision was transmitted to Count Otto at Vienna, who announced it to the Emperor Francis, but did not show him the document itself, which he immediately returned to Paris. All seemed arranged. Francis expressed himself as satisfied, and the marriage contract was ratified. Suddenly difficulties appeared. The religious scruples of the Archbishop of Vienna were aroused, and he declined to perform the marriage ceremony as arranged. This prelate, who had much more respect for the Pope than for the Emperor of the French, demanded to see the original copy of the decree. Never had negotiations of such high importance been troubled by a more singular incident. The alarm of the French ambassador is shown in a long despatch which he sent to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on the last day of February. He was so much upset that he also wrote the Prince de Neuchatel, the ambassador extraordinary of Napoleon, to defer his arrival at Vienna by a few days. After several days of painful uncertainty, the scruples of the prelate were removed by a declaration signed by Count Otto, a copy of which he sent to Paris on the 3rd of March. He formally affirmed over his signature as ambassador that he had read the original decree of the Ecclesiastical Court of Paris, and that, in conformity with the Catholic ecclesiastical laws established in the French Empire, the said marriage had been declared entirely null because, at the time of the conclusion of this marriage, the most essential formalities required by the laws of the Church had been neglected. He further attested that, under the civil laws in force at the time of this marriage, every conjugal union was based on the principle that it could be dissolved at the will of the contracting parties. In the letter which accompanied this remarkable affidavit, Otto practically confessed that he was convinced that the Archbishop would not have consented to officiate if he had known upon what flimsy grounds the decree was granted. Finally, he concludes, this means has succeeded, and the delay in the arrival of Monseigneur le Prince de Neuchatel prevents the public from even suspecting the existence of this discussion which has given us so much anxiety. At Vienna the arrival of the French ambassador extraordinary was anxiously expected. For this position Napoleon had selected his chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, sovereign prince of Neuchatel, vice constable, and grand huntsman of the Empire. On the 6th of March he finally reached Vienna. It was certainly an unfortunate augury for the future that he entered the capital over a temporary bridge built across the ruins of the former city walls, which had been blown up when the French army left Vienna at the conclusion of peace. He was magnificently installed at the Chancellery of the Empire, where he had the same service as the Emperor himself. The following day was Ash Wednesday, and there were only some informal receptions and a military dinner given by the Archduke Charles. The next evening there was a solemn audience at the palace, with the formal demand from the Archduchess, to which the Emperor briefly replied, "I accord the hand of my daughter to the Emperor of the French." Then Marie-Louise appeared, and Berthier presented to her a letter from Napoleon, and a medallion portrait surrounded with 12 enormous diamonds. To his address the Archduchess replied, "With the permission of my father, I give my consent to my union with the Emperor Napoleon." On the 9th the final marriage contract was executed by Berthier and Metternich, the one signed at Paris having been only preliminary. The terms based upon the contract of Marie Antoinette were: dot of 500,000 francs, the same sum in jewelry given by her father, balanced by 600,000 to be given by Napoleon; dowry of 500,000; annual allowance appropriate to her high rank; renunciation of her right of succession in the Austrian dominions. Finally the marriage was celebrated on the 11th of March, which was a Sunday, the only day on which marriages are allowed during Lent. Through streets lined with soldiers, the procession moved in great pomp to the Church of the Augustins. At the door of the church the cortege was met by the archbishop, who presented the holy water. He then returned to the altar, while the imperial family took their places in the choir. The Archduke Charles, representing the Emperor Napoleon, and Marie-Louise then knelt on the prie-dieu before the high altar. The archbishop having blessed the marriage rings, presented to him in a cup, Charles and Louise advanced to the altar, where the ceremony was performed in German according to the Viennese rites. After the exchange of the nuptial rings, Louise took back the one intended for Napoleon in order to present it to him. Then the Te Deum was chanted. Salvos of artillery and the ringing of all the church bells in the city announced to the people that the ceremony was over. After the benediction the procession returned by the same route to the palace. Following the reception at the Burg, there was a large banquet. At the table the new Empress of the French was seated in the center, with the Emperor Francis at her right, and the Empress at her left. Then followed, on the two sides, the 7 archdukes and the Prince de Neuchatel. According to the etiquette of the Court of Vienna, ambassadors were only invited to the table of the sovereign on very rare occasions, and then they left when the dessert was served, to mingle with the crowd of seigneurs in the banquet hall. But on this occasion Berthier, in his capacity of sovereign prince of Neuchatel, remained until the end of the dinner. That evening all the theatres gave free performances. The Emperor and Empress, with the bride, drove around the city in an open carriage, and were cheered by the good people of Vienna who crowded the streets. The city was brilliantly illuminated, but a high wind soon extinguished nearly all the lights. End of chapter 17 and 18.